Welcome back to our studies on the book of Revelation. In our last presentation, we looked at the main theme in the book of Daniel, and we emphasized that this theme is judgment. Now, I promised that we would move on to the book of Revelation, and here we are. But let us remember the main point that we are looking for, the main emphasis that we are highlighting, is that we are looking at judgment. That's the main idea. So let us look and see if this is the theme that we find as we go to the book of Revelation. First of all, what is the overall focus of the book of Revelation? Well, let's just go to the beginning of the book, and I want to read a couple of verses from there that give us a kind of springboard from which we go into the book. In verse 1, first of all, it says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him to show unto his servants things which must shortly come to pass, and he sent and signified it by his angel unto his servant John." The first point I want to highlight here is that the book is called The Revelation of Jesus Christ. Well, that is not what it is called. If you go to the King James Version, it is referred to as the Revelation of St. John the Divine. But I think that is wrong, because the first line of the book says, the Revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, this sentence can have more than one meaning. It could be the revelation given by Jesus Christ, or what I think is more appropriate, it is the revelation about Jesus or the revealing of Jesus, because I think this is what the book is really about. That's point number one. Point number two, it says it concerns things which must shortly come to pass. Now somebody will say, well, Revelation was written 2,000 years ago. How come these things have not yet come to pass and come to pass shortly, as John suggested? Well, the truth is that this word shortly could probably be better translated things which must come to pass quickly. And if you say, what's the difference? The difference is this. The idea is that when these things begin to come to pass, they come to pass in rapid succession, quickly, one behind the other. In a short space of time, once revelation begins, it will come to an end. This is not a long, drawn-out series of events. That's the point. The third point I want to highlight is that in verse 10, same chapter 1, it says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet." This is John speaking, and he says, "I was in the Spirit." What does that mean? I mean, some people might think maybe he was speaking in tongues. That's what some people think when they think of being in the Spirit. But really, what John is saying is that I was wrapped up in the power of the Spirit. I was taken away through the power of the Spirit. I was wrapped up, enveloped in the power of God's Spirit. Through the Spirit, he was taken into a different experience. Now, the point is, he says, this happened on the Lord's day. There is a lot of argument as to when this Lord's day is referring to, what point in time. Some people say it was referring to a Sunday, fanciful thinking. Others say it was referring to a Sabbath. In my opinion, equally fanciful. What John is saying, he was referring to another day of the Lord that comes up in the Bible over and over again. If you look at the book of Isaiah, Ezekiel, many of the prophets, even the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul, they spoke about a time that they referred to as the day of the Lord. Paul said, and Peter said, the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. What were they referring to? They were referring to a point in time when God would intervene in the affairs of this planet. And once again, the earth would see God's power, God's intervention mightily manifested. That is what is meant by the day of the Lord. And I believe this is what John is referring to. Through the Spirit, I was taken into the day of the Lord, which he here refers to as the Lord's day. Now, I'm going to go straight to chapter 4. I'm not going to spend much time or any time looking at chapters 1, 2, and 3. And you may ask why. It's because the main message of Revelation is to be found between chapters 4 to 19. And as we proceed, you will see why I say this. I'm not saying that chapters 1 to 3 are not important, but for the purpose of our studies, we're not going to delve into those chapters. Jesus sends messages to the 7 churches, and they are there in chapters 2 and 3. But we are going to delve into the meat of the book, the prophecies, and try to understand what they mean. So we go directly to chapter 4. And in verse 1 it says, "After this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was as it were of a trumpet talking with me, which said, Come up hither, and I will show thee things which must be hereafter." This is John speaking. He heard a voice. He saw a door opened in heaven, and he heard a voice saying, "Come up here." Now remember, John was in the Spirit. And so he's being invited in the Spirit, whether in vision or literally his spirit is taken there. The Bible doesn't say. But through the Spirit, he finds himself in this place in heaven. And he's told that what you will see here is things which will happen after this. Now remember, John received this vision in AD 95, thereabouts, sometime near the end of his life. More than 70 years after Jesus went back to heaven, around about 70 years, John had this vision, long after the apostolic church was started. Now, why am I saying this? Because there are people who believe that the next thing that John sees when he goes into heaven, he sees Jesus being accepted by God and establishing the kingdom. That's what they believe. But clearly, this is wrong, because the voice tells John, "I will show you things that must be hereafter or after this." We are not going to see at this point Jesus being inaugurated as high priest. We are not going to see Jesus becoming the head of the church. No, that happened 40 years in the past. The things that John is about to see are things future to his time, things that were to happen hereafter. Now, John goes into a room, this open door, and what does he see? First of all, he sees something that looks like a sea of glass. He sees a magnificent scene. It looks like a sea of glass, but then he sees a throne is set in place, and God takes a seat. He says one sits on the throne. God takes a seat. Now, around the throne, first of all, there are 4 living creatures, 4 strange-looking creatures. One of them has the face of a lion. One has the face of a man. One has the face of a calf. One has the face of an eagle. Actually, these beings are angels. They have 6 wings, and they are standing there. They are crying, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty." Now, a little further out around the throne, there are 24 seats or 24 lesser thrones, and there are 24 elders sitting on these thrones. Then round about on the outer circle, there are thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of angels. This is a scene that John steps into when he's invited to come up here. Now remember, what are we looking at? John is told you're going to see something that will be hereafter. After this, we are looking at something that happens in the future. Let me emphasize something. This is not an ordinary day in heaven. This is not a normal event. John is not taken into heaven and looking at what are they occupied in doing in heaven day after day. No, this is a special occasion. That is why he's invited there. Something to happen in heaven, future to the time of John. It says at the beginning, a throne was set, or a throne was placed in heaven, and one sat on the throne. The throne is put there. God comes and takes his seat. It is not your normal day in heaven. Something special is happening. Now, let me tell you right at the beginning what is happening. In our last presentation, as we looked at the book of Daniel, what we saw was that there was also a throne set in place. If you will recall, there was a throne set in heaven, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, and it tells us that there were thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands standing before the throne and around the throne. This is the exact same scenery that we are looking at here in Revelation. Let me just highlight this before we move on. If you will look at the chart on the screen, On the left, I have Daniel chapter 7. On the right, I have Revelation chapters 4 and 5. The first point you find in Daniel is that there are thrones cast down. Go over to Revelation. There's a throne set in heaven, plus there are also thrones put in place. The second point, God takes a seat. That's in Daniel. Revelation, one sat on the throne. God also takes his seat. In Daniel 7, a fiery stream is coming from the throne. In Revelation, it says, out of the throne, there is proceeding lightnings. Same thing, fiery stream, lightnings. In Daniel 7, it says, the books were open. In Revelation, it says, there is a book with 7 seals, which is also open. In Daniel, it says that 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands stood before God. In Revelation, it says 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of angels were standing around the throne. As you look at this chart on the screen, you can see that the two scenes are identical. This is the connection that I wanted to make between Daniel 7 and Revelation. This is a key transition. It shows us that there's a connection between Daniel 7 and the book of Revelation. What is the connection? Well, here it is. Revelation does not tell you what is happening. John simply says, I'm taken into heaven to see something in the future. What is this future event? Easy. Go back to the book of Daniel, and what does it say? When it describes the same scene, what does Daniel say? He says, the judgment was set and the books were opened. That is the connection. So you come to Revelation, it doesn't mention the judgment, but it's the same scene. It's future to the time of John. John is taken into heaven to see the very judgment that Daniel spoke about. This is the key to help us to understand what is going on in the book of Revelation. All right. So now I'm going to ask you to just observe briefly the chart I have on the screen. It's an outline of the book of Revelation. If you look at the top, you will see where we have the chapter numbers from chapter 1 to chapter 22. Now, in the first section, labeled 1, you see where it says Introduction and Letters to the 7 Churches. These are the 3 chapters that I did not comment on. I said we are going to bypass those chapters. If you will look at section 2 and section 3, you will see they are labeled The Judgment of Christ's Kingdom, and section 3, The Judgment of the Beast's Kingdom. That covers from chapters 4 to chapter 19. Then at the end, we have the 4th section, which we have the millennium, we have the final judgment, we have the new earth, and we have closing exhortations. Now, we're not going to spend much time looking at the last 3 chapters either. Why? Because by the time you come to chapter 20, it is over. Chapter 20 brings us to the end of this world's history. What we are concerned about in these studies, we want to know what is the message of Revelation that applies to us here and now. By the time we get to heaven, chapter 20 of Revelation, it is over. It is interesting what happens in chapters 20, 21, and 22. But the main point, the main focus of our message is the judgment of the 2 kingdoms. Remember the book of Daniel? The judgment of the 2 kingdoms. Now you can understand what is the overall message of Revelation. It focuses on the judgment of the 2 kingdoms. So the first section we will examine is from chapters 4 to 11, which speaks about the judgment of the kingdom of Christ. So we can conclude John is taken into heaven and he goes into the throne room and he sees this judgment scene taking place. Now, is there anything else to support what I just said? Is there any other evidence to support that we're actually in the place of judgment? Well, first of all, look at who is gathered there. Look at who are there. You have, first of all, the millions of angels. What are they doing there? Something is happening in heaven and they are gathered together. Then secondly, there are the 24 elders sitting on thrones, and these seem to be people who came from planet Earth. There are 24 elders sitting there. And thirdly, there are the 4 living creatures. Now, let's take a moment and examine these 4 living creatures who have the face of a lion, calf, man, and eagle. Strange looking creatures, strange looking angels. Now, before we go, let me just explain. It is kind of a little silly to believe that these are actually what these angels look like. Last time I said this, somebody said, well, of course it could be. Well, of course it could be. God can do anything. But I don't think in the book of Revelation, this is what God is emphasizing. I'll just show you one reason why I don't think so. A little later on, we see a lamb that is slain. He has 7 horns and 7 eyes. Who is this lamb? Well, clearly, as you read the passage, this lamb is Jesus Christ. And that kind of sets the stage for what I'm saying. Jesus is not a lamb. Jesus does not have 7 horns and 7 eyes. But in the book of Revelation, he is represented as a lamb. So God is using a symbolic representation so we can learn some lessons about Jesus. Same thing with these 4 living creatures. Symbolic representation, lessons to be learned. So let us see what we can understand, what we can learn from looking at these 4 creatures. Let's read, first of all, what it says about them in verses 6 to 8. It says, and before the throne there was a sea of glass like unto crystal, and in the midst of the throne and round about the throne were 4 beasts or 4 living creatures, a better translation, full of eyes before and behind. And the first beast, first living creature, was like a lion, and the second living creature like a calf, and the third living creature had a face as a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures had each of them 6 wings about him, and they were full of eyes within. And they rest not day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come. Now, what do these 4 living creatures represent? To be honest, I searched to try to find this answer. It's not very evident anywhere. The closest I could come to is this. I'll read what I found, and then I'll draw my conclusions. Now, I'll quote from Sir Isaac Newton, who was a dedicated student of the book of Revelation. This is what he said. The people of Israel in the wilderness encamped round about the tabernacle. And on the east side were 3 tribes under the standard of Judah. And on the west were 3 tribes under the standard of Ephraim. On the south were 3 tribes under the standard of Reuben. And on the north were 3 tribes under the standard of Dan. The standard of Judah was a lion, that of Ephraim an ox, that of Reuben a man, and that of Dan an eagle. Where did Isaac Newton get this interpretation from? Well, there's somebody else who comments on it. Barnes, in his notes on the Bible, says, tradition appropriates the 4 cherubic forms, the lion, man, the ox, and the eagle, to the camps of Judah, Reuben, Ephraim, and Dan, respectively. So Barnes tells us that this interpretation has come from tradition. Now, we don't depend on tradition, but tradition simply means oral history. That is what has been passed down from mouth to mouth. Even though we don't depend on it for our doctrinal foundation or our doctrinal basis, sometimes looking at what people believe can give us a clue as to what something means. And in this case, I'm going to suggest that this plants an idea in our minds that I want to follow up. I believe that this idea, though it comes from tradition, it makes sense. In other words, these 4 heavenly beings represent the 4 angelic groups that were assigned to Israel: lion, calf, man, and eagle. There were groups of angels that God assigned to Israel. And so these angels are constantly in the presence of God. You know, Jesus said, the angels that look after his children, they do always behold the face of my Father, which is in heaven. So how does this tie into the idea that we are there in the judgment? Look at what it says about these beings. They are full of eyes. Why eyes? What do eyes represent? Eyes are used for seeing. Okay? When it says that Jesus, the Lamb, has 7 eyes, it means that he sees everything. These beings are full of eyes. What God is telling us is that these angels are these groups of angels. They are able to see Not everything. Only God can see everything, but they are able to see almost everything. They are able to see a great deal, and particularly with regards to what is going on in Israel or among God's people. So, how does this fit into the idea of a judgment? Because in the judgment, you need witnesses, you need evidence, you need people or beings who see and understand what is going on. Remember, even though the judgment is focused on the kingdom of Christ, remember the target is God. God is the one who is ultimately being judged. His government is being judged. And so God's evidence, the fact that God sees everything, is kind of irrelevant. What we need is witnesses who can tell what they have seen, who can tell what has been going on, somebody other than God. And that's why these four living creatures are right in the middle of that scene, right in the middle of the judgment, because their testimony is critical. Now, the next significant thing that happens here, in chapter 5 and verse 2, John says, "And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof?'" Now, something makes John understand that this book is of critical importance. I don't think John understood all that we are talking about here. I don't think so. He's in heaven, he has been invited there, but he has no clue what is going on. But he recognizes that there is something of great importance in this book. Nobody answers the question, who is worthy? And John starts to weep. He starts to cry. Then somebody says to him, "Do not weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root and the offspring of David, has prevailed to open the book and to loose the seals thereof." So John turns around and John says, "I looked and I saw a lamb as it had been slain." Something interesting, okay? Take note of this. We will come back to this sometime later on. But notice, John hears a voice that says, "The lion." If you heard about a lion, you would be looking for a lion. But he turns around and instead of a lion, he sees a lamb, a slain lamb. Why does God do this? God is using pictures to give us an understanding of two sides of Jesus. The lion speaks of his majesty, his glory, his kingship, while the lamb speaks of his sacrifice, of the humility that made him die for us. Two sides of one person, two images, both of them telling the truth. So, John sees Jesus step up to God. God has a book in his hand, sealed with 7 seals. Jesus steps up to God and he takes the book out of his hand. Now remember, we are saying that this book is the same as the books of judgment that were opened in Daniel 7. Same thing. But here in Revelation, it's not described as many books, but as one book sealed with 7 seals, 7 sections, 7 compartments. Same thing. And of course, you will understand that although we're looking at something that is happening in heaven, it's doubtful that we're talking about real books written with ink and written with a pen. No, God is using human perspectives, human understanding to give us an idea of what is going on. But it is far more likely that what we are talking about is computers or something far more sophisticated. What we are looking at is the data that is in that book, the data that is relevant in this judgment, the data that involves all the evidence that has been gathered by these 4 living creatures and everybody else. It is in this book. So Jesus steps up to the Father, the Lamb steps up to the one on the throne, and he takes the book out of his hand. Now, I'd like us to take a look at what happens when Jesus takes the book. It says in verses 8 to 10, "And when he had taken the book, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of saints. And they sung a new song, saying, 'Thou art worthy to take the book and to open the seals thereof.' Why? For thou wast slain and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every nation and kindred and tongue and people, and hast made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth." Now, first of all, let us notice that Jesus is the only person in heaven or in earth who can open this book. Why? It says, "Because you were slain and you have redeemed us." Remember something that Jesus said. While he was here, Jesus says, God has given him authority to execute judgment. Why? He said, because he is the Son of Man. take a note of that point. Why is Jesus qualified to judge humanity or to make any judgment, to preside in the judgment? Why? Because he is one of us. He has been in our shoes. He understands perfectly what is happening. So he's the only one qualified to open that book. I would put it to you that God the Father is not qualified. The angels are not qualified. No other human is qualified. The only person qualified is Jesus, because in a judgment that is fair and based on justice, Jesus has the qualifications. He was one of us. He overcame on our behalf. This is why he is the only one who is able to open this book. So let us notice the next thing that happens. And I hope I can describe this in a way that is worthy of what it says. Let's read it first of all in verse 13. And every creature which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth, and such as are in the sea, and all that are in them, heard I say, blessing and honor and glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne and unto the Lamb forever and ever. Hold on a moment. Why is this so significant? I mean, Revelation is full of hymns. That's what people think. No, it's more than simply hymns. All of these messages, God is trying to convey something to our minds. Look at when this happens. When Jesus takes the book, it says, every creature in heaven, in earth, in the sea, under the earth, every living thing starts praising God. Why? Let me take your mind back to what we saw at the beginning. Remember, there is a great conflict taking place in the universe. God's kingdom has been under assault. All the energies and the attention of heavenly beings has been focused on bringing an end to this great rebellion. God's appointed warrior is Jesus Christ. And now Jesus comes to the last few acts in the drama. Opening the book is one of them. Something in this book, the information in this book, is to vindicate and justify God's name and God's government forever. And so when Jesus opens the book, what happens? Every good being in the universe, and ultimately every living thing in the universe, bursts out in spontaneous praise to God. It's not just simply a hymn that God throws in as an afterthought. There is a message. God is saying to us the opening of this book and what it contains is of critical importance to the whole universe, to the destiny of the kingdom of God. That is why when nobody could open the book, John felt this sense of grief and he started to weep. That is why when the book is opened, every living being in the universe, every good entity, recognizing the importance of it, burst out praising God, because this will be the end result of the opening of the book of the seven seals. What I'm saying and what I'd like us to grasp, this is not just simply some book that highlights some prophecies to take place in the future. No, the issues are far bigger than that. The issues concern the destiny of the universe, the government of the kingdom of our God. You know what is exciting? As we continue to study, you will see that you and I are privileged to play a part in this great unfolding drama. What a wonderful thing it is to be alive in a time like this, when the book of Revelation is finally being opened. God bless you. I hope you have understood what I've been trying to say. I look forward to meeting you in the next presentation.
As John stood in the judgment room, he saw a throne of might, and in its presence 4 beasts stood, reflecting glory bright. The judgment of Christ's kingdom come, all heaven gathers here. The evidence of ages gone will prove that God is fair. 1,000 thrones, a great crowd singing songs to one whose majesty was veiled, who held a book yet sealed. Holy, holy, holy Lord, O God Almighty, who was and is to come and reigns eternally. The judgment of Christ's kingdom come, all heaven gathers here. The evidence of ages gone will prove that God is fair. A mighty angel's voice did cry to break the seals, who dare? There was no one who thought to try, no champion, it was clear. But then a lion lamb was seen, a champion strong and clean, with 7 horns and eyes he came to glorify God's name. The beast cried out with endless praise as elders' voices raise. By your pure blood you've ransomed all nations heard your call. Worthy are you, O Lamb slain, you've broken every chain. The judgment of Christ's kingdom come,